Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into something truly fascinating. Excerpts from the collected works of Edgar Allan Poe. You know him for the eerie, the mysterious, sometimes the wild and, well, strange.
Absolutely. And these particular sources, they give us a real sense of that incredible range from these tight analytical puzzles to flights of pure unsettling fantasy.
Right. Our mission here is to sort of comb through these specific texts and pull out the core insights, the real nuggets, particularly around how Poe uses intense observation, rigorous analysis, and yes, that signature touch of the bizarre to explore the worlds he creates.
Yeah, we've got a bit of a mix in front of us. A few biographical notes offering a glimpse into his circumstances, some discussions on the very nature of analytical thinking, two deep dives into his famous detective stories, and then a sharp turn into some of his more far-out fantastical tales.
All right, let's see what we can unpack from this collection. Kicking things off, these sources include a brief look at Poe's personal context, painting a picture of, well, hardship. There's an account here that speaks of goodness in Edgar Allan Poe, suggesting it's necessary to lift the veil covering the grief and refinement and poverty he experienced.
And a central figure in this part of the account is Mrs. Clem, his wife's mother. We learn she sought employment for him, explaining he was ill, his daughter, his wife, Virginia, was a confirmed invalid, and their financial situation, well, it compelled her taking it upon herself to seek help.
The description of Mrs. Clem is quite poignant, really. The text says her face was made beautiful and saintly with an evidently complete giving up of her life to privation and sorrowful tenderness. It describes her gentle and mournful voice and habitually and unconsciously refined manners. It really emphasizes her devotion.
And the source makes it pretty clear why that devotion was needed. Poe apparently wrote with fastidious difficulty and in a style too much above the popular level to be well paid, so he was always in pecuniary difficulty, and with his sick wife, frequently in want of the merest necessaries of life. Just the basics.
It sounds incredibly tough. The account tells us Mrs. Clem was constantly from office to office with a poem or an article to sell, sometimes pleading because he was ill. And strikingly, the source notes she never, amid all her tears and recitals of distress, let even one syllable escape her lips that could convey a doubt of him or a complaint or a lessening of pride in his genius and good intentions. Quite something.
Even after his wife's death, the account says she remained his ministering angel, living with him, caring for him. It's a powerful image, isn't it? Loyalty in the face of extreme difficulty, which the author seems to suggest reflects something about Poe himself, too.
Okay, so from that personal struggle, the sources shift gears pretty dramatically into the realm of pure intellect, introducing the concept of analysis through an unexpected comparison. Chess versus drafts, or checkers as we'd call it.
Yes, the text makes a seemingly counterintuitive argument that the higher powers of the reflective intellect are actually better exercised by the unostentatious game of drafts than by all the elaborate frivolity of chess.
That feels backwards. Chess seems so much more complicated, right?
It does, yeah. But the reasoning offered in the source is that chess is complicated, but primarily requires intense attention because of all the varied pieces and their complex moves. The text says it's the more concentrative rather than the more acute player who conquers.
Oh, okay.
Drafts, though, has simple moves, requires less constant attention to the rules, forcing advantages to be gained by superior acumen, by depth of thought, really. The analyst in drafts, it says, throws himself into the spirit of his opponent, anticipating their simple moves many steps ahead.
Ah, I see. So it's a difference between managing complexity versus applying deep insight to simplicity. Makes sense. And this abstract idea leads us directly to see Auguste Dupin, introduced in these texts.
Right. Dupin is presented as a young gentleman from an illustrious family, but he's fallen on hard times, living the secluded life in Paris with the narrator in a rather decaying, time-eaten, grotesque mansion. Sounds very Poe.
The narrator is clearly captivated by him, speaking of being astonished by his vast extent of his reading, and how his own soul is enkindled by the wild fervor and the vivid freshness of his imagination.
What's particularly interesting from the narrator's perspective is Dupin's moods, where his mind seems to possess a bipart soul, the creative and the resolvent. It's this idea of both imagination and the ability to break things down logically that defines him in these sources.
Yeah, the source gives a great example of this analytical power. Dupin seems to track the narrator's thoughts during a stroll, making connections that seem almost like psychic linking the Orion Nebula to a bitter tirade against a cobbler named Chantilly.
Exactly. And the explanation provided is pure analysis. Dupin wasn't reading minds. He was meticulously observing the narrator's subtle actions, expressions, reactions to things they passed or recently discussed. Using those tiny clues to deduce the complex chain of thought step by step. Its analysis applied not just to problems, but to human behavior itself.
For that picture of the analytical mind, let's turn to the first big narrative puzzle in the sources. The most extraordinary and frightful affair of the murders in the Rue Morgue.
Right. The sources present this mostly through excerpts from newspaper accounts detailing the horrific scene found in an apartment. Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter are found dead.
The medical testimony from surgeons M. Dumas and Alexandre Etienne is incredibly graphic. Mademoiselle L'Espanaye was found forced up the chimney, severely bruised and scraped, her throat badly chafed, with distinct finger impressions below the chin. She was clearly throttled.
And her mother's injuries are described as far more extensive, horribly mutilated, with shattered bones in her leg, arm, and ribs. An obtuse weapon wielded by a very powerful man was suggested, the surgeons explicitly stating no woman could have inflicted the blows. Her head was entirely separated from the body and was also greatly shattered, her throat cut with a very sharp instrument. The sheer brutality described in the source is staggering.
And the baffling elements are what stumped the police, according to these accounts. Witnesses heard screams and a struggle, but couldn't agree on the language spoken by the killer or killers. Descriptions range from specific languages like Spanish or French to just, shrill, harsh, and unequal, just sounds.
Crucially, the apartment was locked from the inside. The doors were bolted, the keys inside. The chimneys were too narrow even for a large cat. The police are described as entirely at fault, with not the shadow of a clue apparent. Even the one arrest made, Adolphe Lebon, seems unfounded based on the facts presented.
This is where Dupin steps in. The source says he was singularly interested. He tells the narrator that the police's inability to solve it is in direct ratio to how easy his own solution will be, which is quite a statement.
It is. He operates on a key principle. In such unique cases, the focus isn't just what has occurred, but specifically what has occurred that has never occurred before. He's looking for the anomaly, the thing that breaks the pattern.
So he goes to the crime scene with the narrator, examining everything with incredible detail, minuteness of attention, including the bodies themselves.
His analysis of how the perpetrator escaped is a prime example of his method. Starting logically, the escape wasn't supernatural, it had to be physical. He eliminates the possibilities the police considered. No secret passages, doors bolted from within, chimneys too small.
Which leaves the windows. But the police dismissed them because they were found fastened from the inside. Seemed like a dead end.
Exactly. But Dupin deduces, based purely on the logic of elimination, that there must be a way for the windows to fasten themselves from the inside after being opened and used for escape. He examines the window the police overlooked because it wasn't broken, finds a concealed spring, and realizes the nail wasn't driven in fully. It could be manipulated from the outside and then appear fastened from within due to the spring mechanism snapping it shut. He cracks the physical impossibility.
Cover.
And he connects this to the nature of the violence and the voice heard. The source emphasizes the prodigious power needed to tear out the mother's hair, roots attached with fragments of the flesh of the scalp, just brutal.
This brutal ferocity, the butchery without motive, and the description of the horror as grotesquerie, absolutely alien from humanity. It leads him to link it with the witness's inability to identify the voice as any known human language, describing it as foreign in tone and devoid of all distinct or intelligible syllabification, not words, just noise. So putting it all together, the impossible, agile entry-exit, the superhuman strength required for the injuries, the motiveless, grotesque violence, and the non-human voice, it all points away from a human perpetrator, doesn't it?
Pretty much forces that conclusion. The reveal presented in the source is Dupin's conclusion. A large, tawny orangutan. He explains how the physical evidence matches the capabilities of such an animal, immense strength, agility, the ability to navigate that window mechanism, maybe even accidentally.
And to wrap up this case within the sources, Dupin places an advertisement for the animal's capture, inferring its owner might be a sailor, perhaps from a Maltese vessel, a detail he admits is an inference, not a certainty, but part of his analytical leap. Now, let's look at another case from these collected works, one that applies this same analytical approach, but with a fascinating twist, as highlighted by the sources themselves.
Yes, The Mystery of Marie Roget. This one is unique because, as a footnote in the source explicitly tells us, it's based on a real, unsolved murder case that happened in New York, the death of Mary Cecilia Rogers.
Right. So Poe took the actual publicly known facts and newspaper accounts of a real-life tragedy and framed it as a Parisian mystery in his fiction, using Dupin to analyze the real events based only on the limited information available at the time. That's quite an undertaking.
It's an incredible experiment, really, applying a fictional detective's rigorous analytical method to actual, messy, real-world facts drawn from public reports, trying to solve it through fiction.
The situation presented in the source is the disappearance of Marie Roget, who worked at a perfumery, from her home. Her fiancé, Saint Eustache, is initially suspected. Standard enough start, maybe.
The sources then detail the discovery of her body in the Seine, identified as Marie Roget. Medical testimony describes her condition. No foam, suggesting she wasn't poorly drowned, but significant bruises and impressions of fingers on the throat. Her arms were rigid, hands clenched or partially open, with 2 circular excoriations on her left wrist, looking like rope marks. Her right wrist and back were chafed.
And critically, a piece of lace was found, tied so tightly around the neck as to be hidden from sight. It was completely buried in the flesh, fastened with a knot under her ear. Medical opinion stated this alone would have sufficed to produce death. The testimony speaks of both her, well, virtuous character and the brutal violence involved.
Witness accounts included a Madame D and her son hearing screams of a female near an inn in the area where Marie's clothing was later found, describing them as violent but brief.
Huh?
Madame D recognized the clothing. An omnibus driver saw Marie cross a ferry with a young man of dark complexion. Relatives confirmed the clothing found in the thicket.
Then there's the tragic discovery of St. Eustache near the thicket, the lifeless or nearly lifeless body, with a laudanum file and a suicide note stating his love for Marie. Adds another layer of complication.
Definitely. Dupin, analyzing the newspaper accounts provided in the source, particularly critiques the paper, L'Etoile's suggestion that the body found might not be Marie's, that it could be a hoax or coincidence.
He argues against relying only on clothing for identification, sure, but insists that the cumulative evidence from the corpse itself makes the identity almost certain. He lists the details: size, appearance, that specific hairy appearance on the arm, small feet matching Marie's, shoes, bonnet, flowers in the bonnet, garters, calling each piece multiple evidence proof, not added to proof, but multiplied by hundreds or thousands, building the case.
He really hones in on the garters. He notes they were elastic clasp garters tightened by setting back the clasp. He argues that elastic garters rarely need this manual tightening. It was an accident, in its strictest sense, a very specific detail that strongly confirms the body's identity, contrary to the newspaper just dismissing it as usual.
Dupin also uses the state of the body and the finding of the clothes nearby to deduce the murder happened near the thicket, with the body put into the river there rather than floating downstream from somewhere else. Location matters.
He even analyzes Marie's actions before she disappeared, asking why she would tell St. Eustache to call for her later Sunday if she was just planning a quick outing to meet someone else. Asking him to call implies she intended a longer absence or no return, suggesting maybe a planned deception on her part.
And this case prompts Dupin to discuss broader points about the nature of analysis itself, right? He criticizes limiting inquiry just to the immediate facts, the malpractice of the courts, arguing that a vast, perhaps the larger portion of truth arises from the seemingly irrelevant, from collateral or incidental or accidental events, things on the periphery.
Yeah. He connects us to modern science's resolution to calculate upon the unforeseen, to try and make chance a matter of absolute calculation, subjecting the unexpected to math, basically.
He also gives a great caution against overextending parallels, like the newspaper comparing this case to a previous disappearance. He references the calculus of probabilities, uses the example of betting on dice. The fact that 6s were thrown twice doesn't change the probability of throwing 6s on a third roll. Seems obvious, but...
But, as he notes, the source says, the merely general reader struggles with this idea, showing an error in only seeking truth in detail, without understanding broader probabilistic principles. We look for patterns even when they aren't statistically sound.
And based on his analysis within the sources, Dupin examines St. Eustache's alibis presented in affidavits and concludes his innocence, finds them valid. So we've seen Poe's mind, as presented in these sources, meticulously dissecting puzzles, even applying analytical logic to real events. But these collected works aren't just about deduction, are they?
Far from it. The sources also give us glimpses into his wild, fantastical imagination. Take the excerpt from Hans Pfaall, describing a journey to the moon via balloon.
And Hans Pfaall's motive is, well, less than heroic. He's fleeing creditors whom he killed before leaving. Not exactly noble.
Right, but the focus in the excerpts isn't really on that. It's on the strange, specific details. The elaborate preparations describe the special varnish, the unique gas, the custom basket, the scientific instruments. Very precise.
Then the journey itself, and that moment of disorientation where he thinks he's falling back to Earth when he's actually approaching the moon, that's quite vivid.
And his observations of the lunar surface, no water, alluvial plains, countless volcanic mountains, what seemed like eruptions sending meteoric stones past him. And the inhabitants, described as ugly, earless, communicating via some unknown method with some strange, inexplicable connection to individuals on Earth. Just bizarre.
And the sheer audacity of him sending a lunar messenger back to Earth to request a pardon for his crimes, with the detailed account of his trip as the price. You have to admire the nerve, maybe.
It's a completely different kind of tale. Then there's Emiscript found in a bottle, a dark first-person account of a ship swept into a relentless current towards the South Pole. Very atmospheric.
The encounter with the enormous ancient ship is incredibly described in the source. Maybe 4,000 tons, deep, dingy black, a single row of brass cannon. There's a palpable sense of dread and awe. You really feel it.
And the captain. Ancient, bearing the stamp of the myriad of years, his eyes like sibyls of the future, his cabin filled with strange iron-clasped folios, moldering instruments of science, obsolete, long-forgotten charts, just dripping with age and mystery.
The narrator feels invisible to the ancient crew, even walking directly before the eyes of the mate. He goes into the captain's cabin to get writing materials, resolving to keep a journal and cast it in a bottle at the very last moment. That fatalism.
It's a tale of the sublime and the terrifying, facing the unknown and inescapable forces of nature and time. Pure horror, almost.
And finally, there's this wild description of Antioch from the source. It's a surreal, satirical look at the ancient city, Epidaphne, contrasting its grand features, fortifications, palaces with its squalor, mud huts, abundance of filth, insufferably narrow streets under the gloom of miraculously tall houses.
And it culminates in that truly bizarre, almost slapstick scene with a gigantic camelopard, a giraffe being worshipped and kicking people, leading to a frantic race to the hippodrome with Antiochus Epiphanes himself, showered with ridiculous titles like Prince of Poets and Most Remarkable of Camelopards, fleeing the crowd. It's just weird.
What a strange, chaotic image to end on in this selection of texts. Very unexpected. So, looking across these diverse excerpts from Poe's collected works, we really see these distinct sides of his genius showcased, don't we?
Absolutely. We have the hyper-rational Dupin, meticulously observing and deducing, breaking down complexity with cold, hard logic, whether in fictional or near-real cases, that analytical machine.
And then we have the boundless imagination of the other tales, exploring lunar voyages, spectral ships, and grotesque ancient cities, pushing the boundaries of the known and the plausible into the realm of the bizarre and the terrifying. Total fantasy.
What's striking, though, looking at these together, is how even in the wildest fantasies, there's often a grounding in intense specific description, like the detailed preparations for the moon voyage, or the precise description of the spectral ship. It feels researched, almost.
Yeah, and conversely, the analytical stories deal with events so extreme and improbable, like the orangutan murderer they brush against the edge of fantasy themselves.
It feels like Poe uses that meticulous observation not just to solve crimes, but maybe to make the utterly alien or impossible feel terrifyingly, viscerally real for a moment. He forces us to confront the inexplicable, either by applying rigorous reason until it kind of breaks, or by simply plunging us into the unknown with vivid, overwhelming detail.
We've taken a deep dive into just a few fascinating corners of Edgar Allan Poe's collected works today, guided by these specific sources.
It's quite a collection, isn't it? Showing the power of analysis and the pull of the fantastical, often in unsettling combination.
As you reflect on these different narratives, what aspect of Poe's approach stands out most to you? Is it the cool, almost detached logic of Dupin, dissecting mysteries piece by piece? Or is it the strange, detailed visuals of lunar landscapes and spectral ships that grab you more?
Think about how Poe uses intense observation and detail, whether to build a case for who committed a crime or to convince you, just for a moment, that someone could actually travel to the moon or encounter an ancient vessel at the South Pole. How does that blending of the real and the impossible found across these texts shape your experience as a reader? What does it make you think about?
Keep exploring those intersections of the observed and the imagined, and join us next time for another deep dive.